Rick Geffken is one of Monmouth County's finest researchers. He digs deeply into his subject, he casts a wide net, and he gets into the heart of the matter. He leaves no stone unturned, and even finds some stones that others wouldn't think to look for. I know and have benefited from his research skills in another town, but today he's telling us about a historic place in our own Middletown Township, a house from one of Monmouth County's earliest founders, the Grovers, a house that's hidden in plain sight on the north side of West Front Street. Take a look as you travel from Lincroft to River Plaza. The house should be hidden no more now that it's occupied by the Navesink Maritime Heritage Association and rehabilitated by them, and its history will no longer be obscure now that Rick has uncovered it and is going to tell us about it. Before he takes the floor, let me also add that Rick is an author. He's brought two of his books, I Know There's Slavery in Monmouth County and Hidden History of Monmouth County. He's also written about
Sure. I'm trying to get the volume up.
Another day for that one. So Rick, please.
Move it right there.
Randy and Tom.
Isn't the volume on your computer working?
What if I stink?
Here?
The way
Right.
you do it, right,
I
exactly.
don't know.
I'll do it.
So thank you for that, and very kind introduction, Randy. So let me establish my bona fides here, so you know. Early part of my life, we lived in Hudson County, a place called North Bergen. My parents, my sister, and I. And we used to come down to the Highlands, where I was lucky that my parents would rent a bungalow every year, and we would come down 35 in those days before the Parkway when I was a kid, and come make a left down Cherry Tree Farm Road and, you know, down into 36 in the Highlands. In 1963, my parents bought a house in Highlands, largely because we had seen this area, and the shore those days was just such an attractive place for especially families in crowded New Jersey. From 63 on, although I went away to college that year, I was in Middletown, wound up teaching in Middletown North. It was the only game in town then on Tinton Road, and then got married, and life goes on like it always does. But that's background. I don't remember particularly being interested in Middletown's history when I was here, because I was at the phase of my life where I was, you know, going to see the world and do a lot of other things. But as luck would have it, as you get older, at least as I get older, things become more pertinent to you. Places that you've been and seen, suddenly you get more curious about. And through my contacts with the Navesink Maritime Historic Association, they asked me to look into the Grover House itself, but that has developed into a story about the Grovers that we're going to talk about tonight. And I have to be on my best because apparently two of the folks dialing in are Grovers. So I'm going to encourage them with all seriousness that if I misstate something or they want to add at the appropriate time, we can do that. And for you in person here with me, don't let this be a lecture if you can avoid it, okay? You can raise your hand or shout out or whatever you want to do about something, anything, a comment or a question as we go along, and certainly we'll reserve spots at the end for questions as well. Okay, with that said, part of my research when I started to look at the Grovers were the obvious sources, you know, newspaper articles. And a lot of you probably do know this, but for years, the house where it is now was not there. Okay, and there was a series of articles in different kinds of local newspapers, Asbury Press, Red Bank, and even the Observer, about what was going to happen to the house. And just to give you an idea of where it originated, it actually had 3 locations historically. Okay, and you can see, I think, whoop, sorry, pressed the wrong one. Okay, so the first location of the house from 1730 for a while was on basically Newman Springs Road, about where you'll see later too, the Parkway entrance is now. And then it got moved back on what had been in those days Grover property behind itself almost in 1953. And then a few years ago, in 1996, it got moved to its current location on West Front Street. So the house has moved quite a bit, but we're lucky that it has, because like so many other things that get lost to time, they get knocked down, especially in New Jersey. I commented today to a friend that every time I drive to a place like Middletown, where I haven't been a lot lately, I look and I think, how'd that get here? You know, but such is life. In any event, that's kind of the history of the house for, you know, several hundred years. And one of the tasks that they ask you to do is find out, when was this house built? And I'm relying on this historian, a guy named William Nelson, who said when he wrote this in the early part of the 20th century, that he saw shingles on the roof of the house, obviously, that were inscribed 1730. Which was a common enough practice, right? Where builders would put, still do probably, if they don't have cornerstones on wood, they would inscribe the date. So that gave us a pretty good starting point. And the other things we found out kind of verified that that time frame made sense. Okay, so let's talk about, how did this all happen? You know, it didn't start in 1730, because Middletown, as you know, has got a really, really deep history. And we have to talk about the Dutch. And then we have to talk about the English. So just to give you an orientation, north is over here in this map, an old map of, this would be Manhattan, okay, New Jersey here, that you could see Sandy Hook there. And way back in the early part of the 17th century, when the Dutch came in, they claimed all of this, New York, New Jersey, even down into Delaware, as a result of Henry Hudson's voyage to this part of the world. And the Dutch were, as you know, I think, traders, and they were involved with the Indians and certainly beavers and you know, animal hides of all kinds. From their little outpost there at the tip of this island, Manhattan, and around 1645, while the Dutch were in charge of this whole area, working out of what is now the Battery area of Lower Manhattan, they called it New Amsterdam, of course. Down from the Massachusetts Bay Colony comes this guy, James Grover, as part of a bunch of people who were following a woman named Lady Moody, okay? And Lady Moody was an Anabaptist, which got her in big trouble. Anybody know what an Anabaptist is? Right. Yeah, so he's exactly right. You know, traditionally in Christian faiths, most Christian faiths, the baby's baptized soon after birth. And the Anabaptists, so-called, decided that, well, that can't be, you know, what does a baby know? How can a baby embrace a faith? So they opposed that, as the gentleman said, and that got him kicked out of the Massachusetts Bay Colony pretty quickly, because this is heresy. You can't, you know, you can't go against this kind of teaching. So Lady Moody was one of these people who was apparently a very fiery, independent woman. She was a widow at this point. She leaves with a bunch of people. They first stop in Providence, then they come down to Connecticut, and they're looking for another place to live. And they get to New York, and they are more or less welcomed, because the Dutch, believe it or not, were pretty ecumenical about who lived under their control, as long as it was under their control. And the Dutch here, when they arrived, said, you know what, go over there to this place, you know, Coney Island, basically, and, you know, set up your little group there, and, you know, that'll be fine. Well, the Dutch had a couple of motives. One was that the Canarsie Indians were there, and they were, because of the way the Dutch treated them, sometimes troublesome. So the Dutch at least partially thought, okay, we'll put these English folks out of the way over there, and there'll be a buffer between us and the Indians. And oh, by the way, we can watch them too. You know what? They're settlers. They probably won't be too much trouble. So James Grover, as it turns out, was one of these folks that came down, and they settled in a place called Gravesend. Anybody from Brooklyn? Anybody been to Brooklyn? Anybody like Brooklyn? No. Okay. So in Brooklyn today, you can visit Gravesend. there's the block of this original settlement that Lady Moody and her followers established a couple of blocks square. You could still see that on any aerial map, and you can still visit that area. So they lived in Gravesend for quite a while. And on this map, it's Coney Island again, roughly. And there's Gravesend. And you could tell, obviously, that, and if you even go over the Verrazano Bridge today for that matter, or go to Sandy Hook State Park, you can see between what was then Brooklyn, what is now Brooklyn, and Monmouth County. And so over the years, these settlers were very well aware that there was a lot of land over there. And some remarkable things happen. One is that James Grover starts to do things that really annoy the Dutch. He puts up an English flag, okay, which is not what they wanted. Okay, they were supposed to be peaceful and, come under Dutch control, but he was kind of a rabble rouser, I guess. And so he was about to be arrested, and he leaves and he goes back to England, which is where he first came from before he even got to Massachusetts. And we know that he meets, when he gets to England, which is remarkable, a guy who is the Lord Protector of the British Isles. You might know him as Oliver Cromwell. So what's going on in those days? In England, right, you're getting through, there's actually a series of civil wars between the royalists who supported the king, and then the parliamentarians, the Roundheads, Oliver Cromwell and these people. So there's this series of wars going on, basically the wars of English succession. Okay, so Grover, for some reason, I'm not sure exactly why, gets an audience with Oliver Cromwell and does a couple of things. There's a long involved history of Oliver Cromwell, but among other things, he was doing some pretty nasty things to the Scotch and the Irish. And what he was doing was, when they would defeat them in various battles, they would take these guys, mostly men, and they would ship them to the New World, the Caribbean, or wherever else they could. Because, of course, all the Caribbean power, or I should say the European powers, are taking over the Caribbean islands wherever they can, as well as up here in the mainland of what becomes our country. And so I'm sure that in that meeting in 1655, Grover and Cromwell talk about, hey, you know what? The Dutch have this really cool port down here. And we, I'm sure they were talking about, there ought to be a way that you could take that over. Why would they want that? Well, remember, in New England, which was controlled by the English, yet they had a pretty, sizable growing population. And then down in the Virginia colonies, you also had English, but in between were the Dutch. And the Dutch and the English were always fighting, okay, over the centuries. So they cook up a deal, basically, and Grover comes back to America. And as it turns out, sometime later, about 10 years later, a fleet of big fleet of 4 English ships pull into the harbor down here off the tip of Manhattan. Peter Stuyvesant, then the general in charge of the colony, surrenders, gives up, and now everything becomes English. But a really interesting thing happened too, I think. It's not as black and white as it sounds. It's not like the Dutch suddenly leave. There were Dutch settlers all over, including in Middletown, what became Middletown. Okay, they were trading, they were seeking places to live for themselves. But to get back to our main story, from Gravesend, there had been a couple of years ahead of time, kind of an expedition of 12 of these men from Gravesend who took a boat across to see if they could buy some land from the Lenapes, right? The Native Americans who were in our part of the world here. And the Dutch confronted them and, you're not supposed to be here. And the English settlers from Gravesend lied. They said, oh no, we're just going to trade with these Indians. But we think that they were really, we know actually, they were really interested in buying land. Okay. Because at that time they wanted to get outside of Dutch control. As it turns out, 1665, when the English take over officially, okay, Richard Nichols, who's the guy that was the head of the fleet and becomes basically the de facto mayor of the renamed New York after the Duke of York. Okay, he grants these 12 men patents, basically deeds, to all of what becomes Monmouth County. So you've heard of the Monmouth patent, sometimes called the Navasink patent. So Grover and these other guys get obviously really lucky. Now, the thing about the patentees, they weren't all necessarily interested in coming here and settling in Monmouth County. Some of them were land speculators. They just wanted to cash in, basically. Grover, however, was not one of those. He wants to move. There's an image of Richard Nichols, and you could tell the Dutch architecture in New York. In any event, Grover sells his property in Gravesend after a couple of years, and he moves to Monmouth County, which is the main thrust of our story tonight. And okay, can we get rid of that? You think, Tom, that top piece? Okay. So Grover comes over with these other folks, and they're kind of slicing and dicing up all this property. And as you know from your readings and your history, a lot of what is, on Kings Highway now were places where these men were settling. They had out farms too, if you will, off property, and they were all over this area. But Grover in particular gets to, and is considered one of the founders of Middletown. Okay. And what he does is he decides with two other guys that he's going to start an ironworks, which sounds funny, right? Because he was a miller. He had corn mills not too far from here, down the road, actually, and some other things. And he was an ambitious guy. And he bought some land with these two other fellas, bought some land over in what is now Tinton Falls, and they're going to mine bog iron. And what is that? Okay, it's not pick and shovel iron, right? We got a very iron-based soil here, right? And when the vegetation deteriorates over the years, you can mine through a very involved process. You can get iron out of that. And iron in colonial days was worth its weight in gold, literally, if not more, because you can do a lot with iron, obviously. So Grover and these two friends, okay, one of whom's a Hartshorn, okay, go to this guy who's, you can tell by his name, Cornelius Steenwyck, is a Dutchman in New York, very, very wealthy. And they borrow money. Grover borrows money, and we have a copy actually of the mortgage. Now, £100 in those days was, I didn't do the calculation lately, but lots and lots of money. So these three guys decide they're going to start to get some iron out of the bog over there in Tinton Falls, by where the falls is today, right? And they run into problems right away. They don't have enough labor, and they don't have the expertise. So they hire some people from Massachusetts they knew who were ironmongers called the Leonards, which name I know you know locally, right? Leonardo, Leonardsville Road, that's all from that family. So they come down and they start working it. And pretty soon the original partners, including Grover, realize that they don't have enough capital and skill. And another guy enters the scene. Now, a neighbor of Cornelius Steenwyck in New York is a guy named Lewis Morris. Lewis Morris is equally wealthy. Lewis Morris is from Wales in England, but he and his brother Richard made their fortune by being sugar plantation owners in Barbados. Anybody been to Barbados? Do you have any of the rum left, or is it all gone? Yeah, it's okay. So, first, like all these colonial powers in the Caribbean, they realized they had this beautiful area to grow anything, and they started with tobacco a lot of times, and then sugar comes, and sugar was again a gold-like product to the rest of the world. And so the Morris brothers and a lot of other English transplants to Barbados make their fortune. And so Lewis Morris comes up, his brother buys an estate up in what is now the Bronx. Anybody know the term Morrisania in the Bronx? That's where Richard Morris and then later Lewis Morris owned property. And Richard buys property up there, but Lewis Morris, who's a neighbor of Steenwyck downtown New York, knows what's going on, and he takes over this mortgage. So now Grover's in debt to him. And pretty soon Grover and his partners bail out, and Lewis Morris takes over this entire thing. And I know this is hard to see, but this is a very, very early map, about 1676, of a surveyor's view of this little village of Tinton Falls. And this is part of Lewis Morris's enormous plantation. and I use that word purposely, to the English, not just, we're used to thinking of it down south. Anything where you planted things was a plantation. And so Lewis Morris takes over, buys a bunch of other land, and pretty soon he's got 3,500 acres in and around this Tinton Falls. Why is he there? Anybody guess why would he be in Tinton Falls? Aside from, buying into an existing business. Okay, so the falls is the clue, right? Back in those days, the falls at Tinton, sometimes called the Shrewsbury Falls, might have been as high as 20 feet. And when you have that kind of elevation, you can do a lot, because remember, there's no such thing as electricity. And in all of our colonial deeds, you'll always find, not always, mostly you'll find references to mills. And you need water power to turn these gigantic wheels to do whatever you're doing. And so Grover sells out to Morris. Morris starts to get interested in agriculture, and he's grinding all kinds of products, wheat and corn and grain of all kinds, so he can ship it up Tinton Falls, up to the Navesink, and up to New York, to the markets in New York. So this begins kind of there was agriculture here in Monmouth County before that, but this certainly puts it on another level. Okay, so Morris takes over. By the way, I should mention, you're going to hear it in a second too, that Lewis Morris is credited, and that's the wrong word, but he was the one that introduced enslavement to Monmouth County. The Dutch had started enslavement up in Bergen County. Hudson County, where I'm from, was at one point part of Bergen County. The Dutch West India Company, in order to lure colonial Dutch over here, were providing them with slaves. So the Dutch introduced slavery in North Jersey, and then Lewis Morris, when he gets here, brings up 60, we think, of his slaves from his Barbadian plantations and brings them into Tinton Falls. So he expands slavery in our part of the world. Okay, now, so Grover continues his life for a while. He's doing a lot of other things, and there's a whole lot about the original James Grover. He was an official in town. He was part of the militia. You'd really have to give him credit for being one of the founding fathers of Middletown as we know it. But he also was smart enough to know that there was other land available, and something else was going on too in those days. You heard about the patents, right? That Nichols was issuing patents to the 12 men, in this case from Gravesend. Well, unbeknownst to Nichols, the Duke of York back in England is also giving almost the same land to two of his friends that you know by name, Berkeley and Carteret, people that had supported the royalty during the war. And they get over, well, they didn't all get over here. Their representatives got over here. And suddenly you have a whole lot of conflict in who owns what. Okay, because the proprietors think that they own the land and they start selling it off, and the patentees think they own the land. And this haunts New Jersey deed history for a long, long time. But Grover, among other people, is smart enough to think, okay, let's get some land from the proprietors as well. Okay, so they can kind of back themselves up. And he gets what is referred to as Grover's inheritance. Okay, in 1675, a cousin of Carteret, Berkeley and Carteret, the two men, named Philip, who's the governor of New Jersey, gives to James Grover 4 Middletown tracts, including one here on the swimming river, okay, which you can't tell from this map, trust me, which is basically on Newman Springs Road today, okay, the original location of when the house would be erected. And it's a huge piece of land. And again, what are these people always trying to do? They always want to be near water for all the obvious reasons, right? You can use it to power wheels if you have a waterfall as an example, or you can dam it to create some current, or you can get your goods, whatever you're producing, up to the port of New York. So he buys this land. 10 years later, he dies, okay? But the Grovers are well established as a family throughout this part of our world at that point. In fact, on a later map, okay, we see here, you can't see it, but you'll have to trust me, right here on what is the Navesink River that goes into the swimming river. It says Iron Mill or Colonel Morris, his ironworks, the original property that James Grover had started that ironworks. And oh, by the way, notice something else. Okay, at various times in our history, our geologic history, the Navesink River didn't make that left turn where it does now into the Shrewsbury, north or south, and go up. It was actually broken through to the sea. Okay, so if you were here where Morris was, previously Grover, you could come up the swimming river, get into the Navesink, and go right out to the ocean and up to New York pretty easily. So again, it's a strategic placement of where he's buying this land, Grover, when he was alive, in any event. A friend of ours, a lot of you might know Rich Fife, who is now actually got promoted. He says to the dark side, but I don't believe for a second. He's an assistant dean at Monmouth University, but he's an archaeologist by trade. And there he is there. And he and I and some other folks went over and looked at a less than impressive Tinton Falls today, but the original site of where a lot of this stuff was going on. And maybe one day we'll get Rich to do some to do a dig there. I think he's up in Morristown this summer doing that kind of stuff. But whatever is there, and I think there's plenty there, will tell a whole lot more of this story as well someday. Okay, James Grover's will is very interesting and important. Okay, here it is, an excerpt of it, 1685. James Grover, Sr. of Middletown, of course, he lists all his children. And then what happened in those days, when you would die, usually three men would come to your property and take an inventory. And they would go through all your goods and chattels, okay, and list it, make sure your debts get paid off, and whatever else is left goes to whomever you want it to go to, in theory. So it's a long list, and you can tell from the list that it looks like James Grover was fairly wealthy, but on the scale of what was going on, he really wasn't. You can't read it, but I will for you. He had about, I forget the total, I think it's 114 colonial pounds of worth when he died, which was a lot of money if you translate it to today, but not as much as Lewis Morris and other people. So he was profitable, but he wasn't the richest of the rich. But also in his will, a couple of 120 pounds, sorry. We have in here that he owns a house, land and mills. He had some mills and some personal property. But what was interesting to find out, a couple of things. One, his executors were his son and a guy named Richard Gardner, also family from Gravesend. And then, whoop, I didn't want to do that fast, sorry. Here too, we see that Hartshorns and all of these other very, very familiar names to us. And I used to puzzle about that until I realized there weren't that many people around in those days relative to today. So of course, these people who had property knew each other and were helping each other out wherever they could. And you see here all kinds of very, very interesting names. The Accounting Estate by James Grover Jr., Richard Gardner. You see Bounds and Stouts and Lippincotts, all these famous Monmouth County names. Okay, let's talk about James Grover Jr. What happens after the original James Grover is passed? So this is an early view of, you could guess, right? Kings Highway, okay, where the village of Middletown is more or less concentrated. And this is a little controversial, but we think that James Grover Jr. built a home on Kings Highway, okay, but where? So let's talk about this for a second. Now, traditionally, we've always said and believed, because of our preceding historians, that the Grover lot was here where he built Junior Malpit Hall, right? Everybody knows that name. And a friend of mine named Len Kleckner, who is of Dutch descent and whose family lived in Middletown, the Vanderventers, has been doing some very, very serious research at the state archives, at least remotely, to try to find out the origins of this house. Because if you've been in Malpit Hall, it's got Dutch elements in there, which doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. But Len and I were talking on the phone last night, and He has now come to believe actually that probably it was a home that Grover Jr. built, but he may have hired local folks who were Dutch carpenters to do it. And that gets us into another thing that I had not thought a whole lot about. But there were a lot more Dutch folks living in Middletown Village than we've ever given them credit for. You know, traditionally, when you look at some of these older maps of the village, you see a lot of English names, which was true. But there were Dutch all around too. The Dutch had been here, remember, before the English. Okay, and the English were smart enough when they took over in the mid-century, 17th century, not to just kick the Dutch out. These people were established, and they were established here in Middletown as well. Okay, so it would be very much within the realm of possibility that anybody building a house, if they didn't have the skills themselves, would hire people that did have the skills, or maybe take over an existing house and add to it. As you probably know, Marpet Hall has been added too many times. Now, just so you know, the Dutch are still around. In fact, Peter Van Nortwick, who walked in, who's one of our historical commissioners, and has helped tremendously with what I'm showing you tonight by allowing me to look at his archives, frankly, is a descendant of many of the Dutch who populated Middletown and our part of the world in any event. So Len Kleckner, as I said, will continue. He and I are in constant contact, and I'll share it with Randy and Tom as well, any new findings that he comes up with. But what's interesting about our history always is there's always another layer to pull back. You know, we take things that we've read by our predecessors, or we find things that we think, there's the answer. And then you peel back another part of the onion, you know, and you find out that there's a little bit deeper history. So Malpit Hall is interesting. By the way, you know that where Malpit Hall now has been moved, right? It was closer to the street and it was moved back some time ago. But in any event, the Grovers get involved in all kinds of things because they're early settlers here, including a pretty famous one that has to do with another Lewis Morris. Lewis Morris, the original, who bought the Grover Tinton Falls Ironworks, had a nephew named after him, frankly, who inherited all his property and expanded it. And Lewis Morris, the nephew, was a politician, pretty ruthless guy, apparently. And he gets himself in scrapes all the time. One of which was a famous riot, so-called, in 1701, when Grover Jr., James Jr., by the way, and his brother Safety Grover, how's that for a name, right? Safety Grover are among the people that stormed the courthouse in Middletown because there's a pirate, allegedly, named Moses Buttersworth, another great name, who is on trial, and Grover and his brother are among a crowd of people that arrest Lewis Morris and hold him for a couple of days. And that's just a little side note to tell you that there's a lot of turmoil going on in Middletown, as in a lot of the colonial era of New Jersey history. By the way, that Lewis Morris grows up to be the first colonial governor of New Jersey. So there's a lot of interesting stories there too. Okay, so anyway, lot 36 is traditionally been where the Grovers were, right here on what is now, guess what road? It was called Waycake Path, but it's this road. Yeah, well, from Kings Highway, here's Kings Highway, and then the road that switches through New Monmouth down to Waycake Creek, that way. Okay, so of course names change all the time. But so where you know the Taylor Butler House is, and now Malpit Hall, was, at least for some period of time, Grover property for sure. Okay, we're going to skip ahead. James Grover II is not James Grover's son. I'm just using these designations for convenience because it has to do with the house. So James Grover II is actually the grandson of the guy we spent a lot of time talking about. And we think it's this man who in 1730 builds the Grover House. Okay. Now, another map here. Here's the Navesink River. Okay, north is up here correctly this time. Here is the swimming river. And down here, part of what had been Grover's inheritance that his grandfather had bought is where James Grover lives. And in his will excerpt here in 1749, we find out some really interesting things. Okay, one, he says his home farm is on the Fulling Brook. Anybody know what a Fulling Brook is? Okay, well, he's talking about what we now call Swimming River, but a Fulling Brook is where you would do, among other things, when you had sheep, okay, and you would shear them in order to clean the wool. You needed water, and there's a lot of different processes where you pound the dirt and all these, hate to tell you this, but women did the dirty work, right? Of creating saleable wool, and they call that a fulling process. Okay, so in his will, he refers to his home farm on the Fulling Brook. And he builds in 1730, as you know, this house, obviously a later picture of it, on this huge 300-acre piece of property that he has, long before there's anything like, Red Bank is there, but not like we know it today down the road. But what he has, we know from his will, is he's got some indentured servants, because he says there, I got 5 white servants whose time is yet to come. What that means is that he had hired men from somewhere who are white indentured servants that had a term to work. Who knows if it was 7 years, but whatever their term was. And at his will, he's saying, they're still part of my property and my estate in the sense that they have more time to work off their indenture. Okay, so that's there. That's an interesting thing to see. But even more interesting, I think, is that he has, this James II, at least one slave, because he says there in the inventory, he's got a Negro man worth 20 pounds. And what's interesting, and you couldn't see it in that other image, when you see these actual wills or the transcriptions, Negroes, they hardly ever say slave, they say Negroes or something like that, are listed with all the other personal properties with a value associated with them. So in 1749, 20 pounds was worth several $1,000s. I don't know the exact figure, but a lot of money. And so that is in his estate, and it goes to maybe one of his kids or who knows, okay? But at least we have established that, like so many other successful people that own property, especially farming property in our early Monmouth County history, they were slaveholders. Okay, so it's no mistake, it's no surprise that somebody like James Grover II would have slaves. Okay, many farmers of any kind of size they try to use white indentured servants where they could. They didn't have enough of them. And so there was becoming a ready supply of enslaved people, originally from the Caribbean islands, as you know, and then later they were coming directly into our part of the world. Which brings us to this. Many Grovers were slaveholders. Okay, and in fact, I just did a little chart here. So James Grover II, we already know about him. Okay, there was another James Grover, part of that family, who had at least 3. And sometimes it's interesting, in these wills, you see this particular will said 1 man, 1 woman, and a Negro girl, Ruth. Why would she be singled out? I don't know. Okay. Maybe she was an attendant to him or his wife or something that had a special designation. One of the Grover relatives too, who married a shepherd, last name Shepherd, had 4 slaves in the period of the turn of the into the 18th century. And this is how the descriptions often read: an old Negro man, an old Negro wench. And you can see that the older Negro woman is worth less money at that point in her life. A young Negro worth 50 pounds and a Negro girl 25. And there was a ranking system. Okay, obviously slaves who could work at the prime of their lives, especially young men slaves, were worth a lot of money depending upon the year. And as the slaves got older, they were worth less. And sometimes these people were even manumitted if they were too old to work anymore. More often than not, they were willed to the next generation, whoever that might have been. And again, not just the Grovers. This is happening throughout, colonial Middletown and Monmouth County. James Grover III, you'll see, We'll talk about, he may have had a slave. We'll talk about his will later. And then a Joseph Grover, an offshoot of the family over in Upper Freehold, has 7 different enslaved people. And again, to reiterate, this is not uncommon in those days. I'm not to indicate here that the Grovers are any worse than anybody else. As horrendous as this is to us, this was common practice for people in those days to own enslaved people to help them create their own wealth. Which brings us to this, okay? Just to give you an idea, remember I said that the Dutch had started slavery in Bergen County, obviously New York too, in the early part of the 17th century. By the time Lewis Morris introduces slavery down here, it expands just as the population expands. So this is a 1737 New Jersey census. We don't even have 21 counties yet, right? It's early in our evolution. Monmouth County right here, I'm going to illustrate. So on these columns here, they enumerate white people, right? Males, women, whatever. This column, these columns say Negroes and other slaves. Who would the other slaves be? Take a guess.
Indians.
Yeah, the Lenapes, right? Anybody who is deemed to be lower class that you can control, you can, if you choose, enslave, okay, one way or another. So 1737, New Jersey is starting to get really, really populous, okay? In fact, of the almost 44,000 people in our state that year, about 4,000, a little shy of 4,000 were enslaved. And that represented about 8% of the total population. Monmouth County, underlined. It's about 11%. Yes, ma'am. Good question. Okay. No. These white people here are free white people. Okay. In there might be some indentured servants as well, because they weren't enslaved. Over here, you're going to have Negroes and other slaves, mainly Lenapes. Okay. But that is a figure that is only exceeded by Somerset and Bergen County, which historically is where it all began, in terms of the percentage of enslaved people in Monmouth County. We're third in the state in those years. Now, that might on the surface look from a slaveholder standpoint as, oh, this is good news. We have a lot of slaves, but it's the opposite, because what's happening is the white slaveholders are getting really, really, really nervous, because as the slave population increases, both naturally and with the help of white men who are, shall we use the word, raping their enslaved women, okay, to create more slaves for themselves, because slaves, by the way, follow the right of the mother in the case of slavery. It's not like English common law where the sons inherit. Here you follow, when you're an enslaved woman, your children are automatically enslaved in those days. In any event, we're all in touch in those days, especially the wealthy people who are slaveholders are in touch and trading actively with the folks in the Caribbean. And what are they understanding? That there are slave rebellions all the time. All right, you probably know the famous one in Haiti, which happened later on, but Barbados had a series of slave rebellions. Jamaica had several. All throughout the Caribbean, whenever enslaved people could muster up enough armament or whatever they could do, they were rebelling against their state. And the folks up here in colonial America understood that and were worried as the slave population increases that their enslaved folks are going to rebel, which they did one way or another. You know, the famous was passive resistance. They wouldn't work as hard as their masters wanted them to, but they sometimes did in fact kill their masters. There's incidents of that. Another Lewis Morris of Passage Point, now Rumson, was murdered by 2 of his slaves in 1695. So from a white slaveholder perspective, the more enslaved people you have, the worse you feel in terms of your own safety. Colonial New Jersey starts passing horrendous laws year after year to control the slave population. You can't teach them to read and write. They can't be out after dark. They can't be within 5 miles of their master's home without a permission slip, et cetera, and petty crimes that slaves commit or are alleged to have committed are punishable by all kinds of horrible mutilations, brandings, death, depending upon what they did. So this is a very, very dicey period in our history, and it's going to take another over 100 years before that resolves itself, as you know. Just to give you an idea of what happened in Middletown, and I know you can't read this. This is this is out in County Clerk's Archives in Manalapan. This is a 1771 list of Middletown slave holders with the number of slaves they own. Okay, and it's an attempt to find out what the tax base is. Okay, they want to figure out, well, it's property, let's tax it. Now, we don't know the slaves' names except if we have incidental information, but we do have here down the bottom, which you can't see, James Grover Jr. has a male and a female slave in 1771. There are other folks on this list, famous names, and the list is certainly incomplete. It's got a total of, I think, 97 slaves. But like always, when people are worried about the tax man, things get hidden. Okay, and these are allegedly adult slaves. Children weren't counted. So this is not to indicate that they only had around 100 slaves in 1771 in Middletown. There were a lot more. Okay, but it's an important document. We've got it for Freehold, we've got it for Shrewsbury, we've got it for Dover Township, Toms River area too. We also, this, by the way, I should tell you, this James Grover here is the son of Safety Grover, who I mentioned before, and the grandson of the original James I. So what had happened in 100 years or so since Grover settled Middletown, what happened was people like Lewis Morris, who was very wealthy and well-known, who has all of these slaves, sort of makes it okay for everybody. If the richest guy in Monmouth County, which Lewis Morris, the nephew, winds up being, has slaves, well, that gives an example for the rest of the population. Boy, if I can afford it, let me see if I can get slaves. And so they're not of his wealth, but most of these folks on this list have 1, 3, 4 slaves, whatever they can afford. And I hate to use this expression, but it's a status symbol. If you have a slave in 1771 Middletown or anywhere else around here, you're signaling to your contemporaries that you're successful, that you can afford to own a person, although they only thought of these people as machines to help them generate their own wealth. Okay, but that's part of our history. And in 1774, again, I recognize you can't read this. There's talk as the revolution is about to heat up, right, and get real. There's talk about manumitting some of these slaves. And among other people, James Grover signs this petition that they sent to Trenton, to the legislature, opposing the manumission of slavery. And you can read, in some of these names, of course, are the same people that we have 3 years earlier on a list who own slaves. So one of the ways to think about this is, if you're running a farm or anything else, a business, and you have enslaved labor that's providing you and your family with wealth, of course you're going to oppose manumission. You don't want these folks just taken away from you. And so a group of people in Middletown signed this petition, and that has its own consequences when the Revolutionary War starts. Different parts of the state created petitions. That particular one was Middletown. Freehold had one too. Groups of people got together who wanted to continue enslaving people and oppose it, because the legislature was making noise about maybe slavery's not so good. Maybe we ought to, free these people. And like any economic bloc, people are going to stand in the way. You see it today in any kind of issue you want to talk about. Okay, let's just look for a second before I go on about the Grover house itself. Grovers lived in that house, and I hope the Grovers online correct me if I'm wrong about this, for over 253 years, through all of its iterations as it moved. Okay, now that James Grover II built the house, and it passed down through the Grovers until what you'll find out happened in 1983. So there's a lot of folks that went through that property and lived in that very historic house. Okay, we're going to get to James Grover III. Now we're going to have a succession line that follows from the second. His son, James Grover III, you can see his dates. He lives during a really interesting part of the colonial history, right? He's going to be there during the Revolutionary War. And he lives now as Monmouth County is expanding. Here you have Red Bank. This is a little bit of a later map. But here's Newman Springs Road. Oh, sorry, I'm wrong. Here's Newman Springs Road. And all over Newman Springs Road, you see Grover houses. Because as the family expands, they build another house for the next generation, the next generation. The original house is right there. And James Grover III lives in that house. And then he does something very human, which you might expect. Not that he gets married and has children, no children rather, but he marries a Stout, another very famous name. But we have a record in 1717 where a traditional Baptist family, the Grovers, suddenly James Grover III decides he wants to become a Quaker in 1777. Why do you think he might do that? I don't know, but the timing is suspicious because by then the Revolutionary Wars kicked in, right? And he actually petitions and gets accepted into the group at, the Shrewsbury Quakers. That's not the original Quaker house that's there now, but right there at what's called the Four Corners. He becomes part of that congregation in 1777. And again, I don't know this, but it looks strongly to me like, and he may have good reasons, he might have been a nonviolent person by nature. The Quakers, yeah. And this is one way that you can get out of service if you declare that you have a religious objection. I don't have any documentation that says that's what this man was thinking, but it sure looks like that to me. Okay, so good question. All right, so as far as we know, by this time, James Grover III doesn't have any enslaved people with one possible caveat here. We'll talk about that in a second. But what I wanted to show you here was what looks to be, this is a painting that was done later, what the Four Corners might have been, okay? So there's the Allen House, that in Shrewsbury. This property here, from the artist's perspective, is where Town Hall now is, etc. The original Christ Church, not the one there now, that was built later. And there was where the Quaker Meeting House was, and now the newer, that's 200 and something years old, is there now. But this is where James Grover III would worship after he gets accepted. Now, to Randy's point here, in his will in 1800, there's a lot of really interesting things. But among other things, what he does is he rents, he has no children of his own. He rents the Grover property on Newman Springs Road, this historic property that's been in the family for generations, to, he says here, the monthly meeting of the Friends in Shrewsbury for 20 years. He wants to have them be able to generate revenue from the farm property, and that's what happens. And he also is the Grover who establishes the Grover burial ground. Do you know where that is? No, not that one. This one is off Half Mile Road. Okay, you can't see it from Half Mile Road anymore. But if you go up there, he was the one in his will that establishes this small plot, which has been overgrown. And by the way, a lot of the Grovers were buried there were then moved later on to Fairview Cemetery as well. But what's, and there it is right there, that little cross that I put there. Here's today's Half Mile Road, and this is all Grover property back in those days. So he establishes a burying ground for his family, which looked like that when it was cleaned up some years ago. They tell me I haven't been there. Randy, have you been there lately? But I've heard it's overgrown and even hard to find. But what else he does in his will, by the way, he has this line that I haven't been able to figure out. He leaves money to, he calls his boy, James Grover Redicore. Now, I don't know if that's an enslaved person. It's not his natural son. It might be an indentured person, but he specifically calls out to this name. So to Randy's question, it may be that he had a slave too. It's hard to know, and it doesn't quite square with his Quaker beliefs, although a lot of Quakers in Monmouth County history also had enslaved people. The abolition movement that the Quakers were very involved in really gets a kickstart later on. Move ahead a little bit to his son, not his son, his nephew, James Grover IV. Now we start to get into more modern times, and these are pictures from the Monmouth County Historic Association. James Grover IV, pictured there about 1860, is really the James Grover who establishes the family as becoming even more wealthy. I mean, they've obviously been landowners and around for a long time, but he's the entrepreneur that does an awful lot of things with this property. He marries, no mistake there, right? A Dutch woman in 1816. There she is, looking as happy as he does. He's very influential throughout not only Middletown, but the county, becomes a state legislator, sorry. And then I looked at his 1840 census. Now, the censuses don't get real, the federal census records don't get real detailed till about 1850. And all you have here is James Grover, and it's got the numerations of males and females, free white people. And then here they have a column, free coloreds, and on the next page, slaves. This Grover has no slaves, but he does have, it's interesting, 12 what are called then free colored persons. Okay, now this is 1840. It's hard to know what that means. At least it means he's got Black people working for him on his farms off Newman Springs Road. Were they former slaves, some of them? Maybe. And why would that be? Well, because in 1804, New Jersey passed an act for the gradual abolition of slavery, which said that slave children born after July 4th, 1804, if they were women, had to serve 21 years to their then master, or 25 years if they were men. So it's possible that some of these 12 free colored persons, especially the older ones, may have at one point been enslaved. By the way, there's no guarantee they were enslaved by the Grovers either. You know, people were buying and selling, so we don't know. But at least from that point forward, there's no evidence that the Grover family were slaveholders. He himself and Deborah had 12 children, and he becomes, among other things, the founder of the Leedsville Baptist Church. You know where Leedsville is? Thanks, it's Lincroft, started by a guy named Leeds, okay, who was contemporary with Lewis Morris, the nephew that we talked about. Okay, and that Baptist church on an old map, here's what I think of as 5 corners in Lincroft. Today, the Baptist church was right on the opposite side. Today, it's an Oriental restaurant. That's the latest building that's there. But by 1860, this James IV has had enough of the farming business, and he leaves and he moves to Red Bank and leaves the farm, all this sorry, I don't know why that happened. All this farm property here along Newman Springs Road to the next generations. But he has, as I mentioned, the guy that decides that he can capitalize on all this farm development and start selling property, I should say, selling the farm produce up to the New York markets. Okay, so not only are they wealthy landholders in Middletown, they're also merchants and they know how to make money. You can't read this, but there was a good article in the Monmouth Inquirer in 1876 talking about this venerable couple on their 50th anniversary, now living in Red Bank. So he retired out of the farming business, must have had a lot of money, and lets the next generation take over. And that next generation is James Clark Grover. I call him the fifth. He's not necessarily the fifth, but just to give you an idea. And he expands all of this. And by this point, all of this property is still in Grover hands, although like everything else in Monmouth County and the rest of New Jersey, it's starting to get parceled up as the years go by and being sold to various people. Here's Leedsville down the other end, as you know, from Red Bank. And the swimming river here, what they called way back in the early days, Fulling Brook, is down there. James Clark Grover V marries a woman called Rachel Stillwell Smith. You recognize the Stillwell name as another old Monmouth County name. Turns out her uncle, Joseph, was the guy that built what was called the Leedsville Hotel. You and I probably, everybody in this room is probably, or I should say, had eaten at the Lincroft Inn. Just this week, I read in the paper that it's now called, I don't know why, except if you own it, you can call it whatever you want. So, yeah. So they claim, and God bless them, it's America. They claim they're going to try to keep the way it looked, but it's not the same. Nor, by the way, was it. I think when I used to go there, they would say that only that little bar in that one room was part of this original structure. So who knows? But at least it's in the same place. But anyway, that's the Stillwell family. And through all of this part of Middletown, of course, these families are merging, they're marrying, new people are coming in. Land is being diced and sliced up into smaller and smaller parcels over time. But we do have some more information about James Clark Grover. He was on the county committee for, this was the annual Freehold Fair in 1862. And of course, he's representing, you can't read it here, he's bringing cattle and other things that he's growing, farm goods, to the, what is now the Monmouth County Fair, I assume. Okay, so they're everywhere, as they have been for a good couple of hundred years at this point. The last child that he and his wife have, he and Rachel have, is Effie Grover. She's born in 1865, the last one of the 10 children. And there's a picture of her later on in life. And you're going to find out some interesting things about Grovers. The Grovers correcting me for anything yet, Tom? Okay, but I'm sure they'll have anecdotes too. It turns out, and this is one of these really unbelievable things, this James Grover, the fifth, dies intestate. Means he dies without a will. He's this really wealthy guy. And even though, his predecessors always had wills, when he dies, he's 56. So I think he's probably a man in good health, or thought he was, and thought, I'll get around to the will like so many of us do when I get older. But that's not how luck worked it out. And in fact, here's a document from the surrogate court saying, hey, the guy's got no will. And that further bifurcates and splits up the property as time goes on. And for some reason, this is not working, Tom. How about we? Okay. Am I back? There I go. Okay. One of the ways that the Grovers in this last part of the 19th century, as I mentioned, are making money is they're utilizing the traffic, the boat traffic from the Navesink River up to New York. Here's a sloop on the Navesink. This is looking from the Middletown side, by the way, toward Red Bank. You might make out a steamship over on the other side. And they are putting their vegetables and fruit, whatever they're growing, on sloops, and they're bringing them up. If the entryway to the Atlantic had been closed, whatever year they were doing this, they would just go up the Shrewsbury River, up through the Hook, and then up to New York. And these Navesink schooners were pretty famous that they were using. In fact, Peter here was kind enough to allow me to look at and take this image of, these are bills of lading from Grovers that they're shipping up. In this case, you might recognize his name, Edward Irvins, right, from Red Bank. He's a ship captain, the yacht works there all these years now. And you can't read it, I'm sorry, but he said, this one is Charles Grover, who's the fifth son. He's shipping up 10 barrels of potatoes, and he's being charged $11.25 and $1.50 for something else. Okay, to ship this up to, where do you think he would ship it to? How about the Fulton Street markets, right, downtown New York? Okay, and there's Charles Grover, and that's what he looked like. We're getting into the photography, or obviously, and that's old Captain Edward Irwins. Boy, you can't get more salty looking than that, right? And he was very famous. In fact, this bill of lading is for a ship called the Jordan Woolley, which in those days left Red Bank at 2 p.m. on Wednesdays and Saturdays at 6. So these are regularly scheduled ships back and forth to New York. So farmers and people producing things and goods could know when to get their goods down to the docks in Red Bank to load them and send them up. And there, by the way, is that schooner here in the foreground. It's hard to make out, the Jordan Woolley, that this man captained for, I think, 30 or 40 years. he was one of many. And when Peter gave me the bills of lading that he's collected, there's all kinds of valuable information about the ship captains and the ships and just a treasure trove of documents. And there it is, one of the pictures of the Fulton Market on the East River, you know, where South Street Seaport is now. And I noticed after it's up and featuring naked little boys jumping into the East River. Sorry, but that's what it was in those days. And as you can see here, chock-a-block along all those slips were these ships. And it was just an incredibly vibrant scene in the 19th century that carried into the 20th century, even after sail was, you know, kind of eclipsed. Let's get back to Effie Grover. Effie Grover lived right at the end from the Civil War up till 1953 in the original Grover house. And then something funny happens, which I haven't gotten to the bottom of. This is an 1873 map that we have. And the Grover house, for the first time, and the only time on maps at least, which are not always accurate, is described to somebody called C.S. Pratt. And I looked high and low. I don't know if Randy recognizes the Pratt name. I looked everywhere, census records, newspapers, anything I could find to try to find out who C.S. Pratt was. And there's no record of anybody living remotely around that area. So I think it might have been a tenant farmer. I have an idea that in the late 19th century, at one point, they rented out the house to some tenant farmers, and maybe whoever the map maker was went that day, and the guy said whatever his name was, and that's how this got on the map. But down here, close to the bridge into Red Bank, by the way, was the James Clark Grover house. Okay, and so you can see now the names have changed. A lot of these places, if you could see it close up, are less Grover and more other names as time goes on. But in any event, Effie Grover's living there, with the exception of a decade. And I looked at the census records, and that's when they're there. But in between, I don't know who this Pratt person was. There's Effie and her husband, and that's a kind of interesting story. Effie is the son of James Clark Grover, daughter, sorry. And at one point, James Clark Grover hires some itinerant Ohio people who are itinerant farmers called the Lums. And they come and they live on the property as they work it. And Effie falls in love with Charles Lum and they get married. And then they move into the original Grover house. So that sort of makes sense to me. She was living here with her father before she got married in his house down toward the bridge. Maybe the tenant farmers took over for a while. Then when she gets married, she and Charles move back into the house because Charles is now going to take the family farm and keep it going. So that's what they do. And then they have a couple kids. Okay. And it's really kind of classic Victorian picture to me. They have two children. Anna Lum was born in 1888, and her brother Floyd almost at actually 1901, it would have been, right? Or 03, sorry. And here's a picture of Anna holding her little baby brother. But they were at that point living there in the original 1730 Grover house. And then Charles dies in 1928, sorry. And we get to the last iteration of the Grover family in that house and in Middletown, barring new information I may get tonight. Floyd Lum, this is a passport picture from 1920, moves away. He gets married, moves away. So he's not interested in living any longer on the family property. Doesn't go too far. But Effie Lum here, it says, and Floyd inherited all the property. So they had an arrangement, who knows what happens, but Effie decides to live on. Effie dies in 1953, and her daughter, Anna, stays in the house. And it says here that at Effie's death in 53, we learn that the house goes to the children. Okay, now, this is when, way back when in the beginning, you probably forget I showed you, there was a little clip about Effie Grover saying she was delighted when the Parkway came through and said, we're going to have to move your house. She wanted to get off, what was now a very busy road. And so they moved her back to the second location of the house to make way for about where the entryway is to the Garden State Parkway there now. That's even been done a few times. Okay, so those of you that are old enough remember those days when the Parkway was now going to revolutionize New Jersey, and it did. In fact, I'd venture to guess that the reason we moved to Middletown in '63 was that it was a lot easier to get there than when we were kids coming down the shore through old Route 35.
When the total state board was supposed to be free.
Remember that?
Yeah.
How'd that work out?
Not so well. 52, my parents moved from Woodbridge. We were in New York in 52, we moved to Aspen. And they had the first development there. Development was called the Barton Parkway. It was where the old airport was.
I remember the airport. Yeah, and that's what was happening. People like me from North Jersey and New York, we were all moving down to the shore eventually. And the Parkway was a big impetus in that, obviously. Okay, but then some more ironies come into the story, I think. So it turns out in 1939, they found this newspaper clipping. This is about a Red Bank ex-convict. Wow, great, right? Who breaks into a series of houses, including the house of guess who? F.E. Grover on Newman Springs Road. And why that's ironic is what happens in the future. Okay, so as far as we know, according to this article, nothing happens. Her house gets broken into, nobody gets hurt. But it didn't work out so well for her daughter. You may know this if you've been in Middletown for a long time, but Anna Lum, right? Anna Grover by descent, in 1983 was beaten to death on the porch of the Grover house, allegedly by an itinerant worker who waited for her. She had been visiting a neighbor, came back, accosted her, and murdered her. So she was the last person of Grover descent that lived in that house. And there she was, Anna, they called her Annie, obviously sometime before that, never married, was the last of the 253 years of people that lived in that home. That's a great question. I forget how old she was, and it says here 95. So, lived a long life, was apparently very well liked, well known in town, and, just was victimized by an awful circumstance. That guy got sent to prison for a long, long time. Anyway, the house sat vacant for a long time on the second location, okay? And then a company called the Lincroft Builders came in, and they were gonna knock the house down, and that didn't happen. And luckily, the house was moved once again in 1996. Randy, do you know the story behind, and I don't, why they weren't able to knock the house down and have it moved? Is there a story there? Why the builders weren't able to knock the house down, instead move it?
Well, the township wanted to preserve it.
Okay, yeah, I thought it had something to do with the township.
They wanted to build colonial style houses, and an actual colonial house would have impaired new development in the buildings.
The ironies abound. But the good news is it did get moved. Okay. And then, as you probably know, looks like that today, because luckily for all of us, the Navesink Maritime Historic Association lease it every year from Middletown. And they call it, as they should, the Grover House. And I was there, a couple of us were there for the picnic a couple of weeks ago, actually, and they do great work over and above just preserving this house. So it's a mix. They're restoring some rooms. They're, I would say, modernizing it. As far as I know, they don't have a plan or the expertise or the money to restore it to its original look. But myself and other folks, I'm sure Randy too, have talked to them about, preserve what you can. But it was in pretty bad shape inside. I mean, you could see, to me, it's interesting, old, who knows how old patterns of wallpaper in some rooms. A lot of the rooms are, the old mud that they used to use on the walls, right, is cracked in a lot of places. So I don't know that they have current plans to get it back to its original state. it's been altered so many times over the years that I think it'd be hard to even determine what it once looked like. But
Is why I called it rehabilitate rather than. restore.
yeah, okay. So it's a vital part of our history in Middletown. Of course, they're doing a good job. We're lucky that it's there. We're lucky that Middletown as a township has endorsed what they're doing. And so hopefully it'll continue being there.
So the property that it was moved to where it is now is township land.
Yes,
So is that property ever over?
where it is now, not that I know of. I don't believe so.
House that is
Yeah, I don't know, Randy. Do you?
Probably
the-
the Stevens.
The Steve, because it's in the Stevenson property. So, yeah, that makes sense.
that has nothing to do with.
Yeah. And did you tell me that the Stevenson family gave the township the parkland and that then they were able to move the house there? Okay, all right. I meant the Grover house, not the Stevenson house. But the land was granted to the town by the Stevensons? Okay, so that's how that came down. But that's a good visit. They're open on weekends, but you might want to call ahead. So if you go, half-mile road, if you make a left away from Red Bank, it's about a half mile on the right. And that sign. Yeah. And you'll see that sign right there at the driveway. Yeah, okay. But I don't know their hours. I know that they're like all volunteer groups, not open on the weekdays. So I would call ahead. They do have weekend hours at least. So, there was very little education unless you were rich enough to hire a tutor for your kids. Okay. We didn't have a public school system for a while. But the other thing is you would tend to educate your sons, not your daughters, because guess what? In my lifetime, women that I knew, young girls when I was a young boy, were tracked toward being nurses or teachers because they're going to get married. God, it's not that long ago, but it seems like a long time ago. That's the way people thought. But that comes out of, English common law and European traditions for, millennia.
I was surprised about Rick when I saw the ages, with a lot of people that lived in their 80s or 90s. And medical, I wondered how he lived that.
You know how you always see these charts about the expected lifespan, and until recently we were getting elongated, and then the pandemic kind of dove that down, but not always. There were families, as you saw here. That's a good point, with the exception of one. These folks, they lived right. Well, first of all, their diet was probably a lot better than ours. I don't think they were eating a lot of cheese doodles. You know what I'm saying? No soda, and they were working their behinds off. I mean, it was tough work. I would suggest that the women were working harder than the men because they had to do everything the men didn't want to do. What would you rather do? Get out and work behind a couple of mules or churn butter? It's easy choice for me, but and we got a question online. So okay, so I didn't mean to focus. What I was doing was I was following the line of the Grover house. And it was interesting to me, at least, that some of them have slaves. But as I thought I said, and I will reiterate, not all the Grovers were slaveholders, nor do I know what anyone in particular of those felt about their enslaved people. Okay, I just know that from the records we have, I think I showed you 5 different people who owned enslaved people. That's what we know. There's a lot of research going on now by a lot of people to try to find out who these people were, what happened to them, and what were attitudes. Now, what Peter did was amazing. Among other things, this collection that I relied on to do this research of Grover documents that he salvaged at was it a garage sale or something? Basically, right, at that Newman Springs property. He was generous enough to donate that, which anybody can look at now, at the Monmouth County Historic Association. And in there were a stack of letters, which I didn't read, hundreds and hundreds of letters. Who knows what's in there? Who knows what people were writing to other family members or friends that's been preserved that might give us an insight, certainly into their lives and what they were thinking, and about how they viewed things like enslavement. I mean, we don't know until we look at that. That's a whole nother deep dive you'd have to do to find out about that. And some people are doing that.
Aren't you amazed? Very cursive writing that you see in those documents. I mean, that this thing, we were kids who learned cursive. Nobody could cursive it.
One of the books was a diary of a young girl of the Grove family. And then some of those books, you could see probably a lot of us had it, where you have to do those lined paper exercises in your letters. Well, that was common education before public schools. You know, you learn how to do that. And so, yeah, that's it's very amazing. But I like the point about how people live long. I think they were healthier generally. And by the way, it's skewed a little bit. If you're wealthy, you know, you can take care of yourself a little better. Medicine wasn't terribly great in the 1700s, but you know, you had resources that other poorer folks didn't have. And
The term life expectancy generally means life expectancy at birth. And in the old days, there was so much infant mortality that the average age was well down there. That there weren't people that lived to a ripe old age. And just now, we have more and more people living into their 90s and even passing 100, but our life expectancy is going down because of mortality in younger people who are killing themselves through drugs and other unhealthy lifestyles.
excellent point. Thank you, Randy. Yeah. So that's a deceptive thing, life expectancy, for that obvious reason. So any other questions from anyone? Yeah. And again, as I said, I'm giving you some highlights. Certainly there's more to be found out about the Grovers. If you ever want to find out, talk to Randy, talk to Tom, talk to Peter, go over to the Historic Association. You know, those are public documents now. You can research.
I have a question from afar, if you can hear me.
Ah. Tell us about that. Let me give you a mic. You can.
Well, there are broadsides that were from that collection. I think I've identified 3 of them of the properties that you had already mentioned: the Newman Springs property, the original Grover House, and I believe that the one with the standing timber on the far left is from what is known today as Oak Hill Academy, the property.
And these books, books about when one of the Stillwells died, they sold off all the property. And so you have these advertising posters so people could go to these sales and, you know, buy and sell things, whatever they want to do. So those are, what's the oldest one there? Do you know off the top of your head? Yeah. So if you don't know, Peter Van Warwick is a collector par excellence. Anything that says Middletown on it, I think it's gone through his hands at one point or another.
It's the 1876 surveyor's map, and is it online?
If it is, yeah, it must have been. That's how I got it, but I'll give it to you. Yeah.
I have a question from afar, if you can hear me.
Anybody
Can
else
you
got
hear
any questions? So the advertisement tonight is you could buy both these books, one of these books, none of these books. I'll be happy to sign them for you. The one on the left I did with Muriel Smith, who you may know, Monmouth County Historic Commissioner as well. That one's my latest one, and they're here. And for a limited time tonight, I'm going to throw in a genuine cardboard bookmark with every sale. You know that? Remember that advertisement on TV? Wait, there's more. There's more.
I have a question.
So anyway,
from
thank you
afar.
very much. I appreciate your time.